Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome from FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress, and New York University's John Bradamus Center. Thank you to our panelists and moderators for taking the time this evening to share some insight with us for this conversation in honor of Black History Month. Thank you to our audience members for joining this conversation titled Lift Every Voice, a bipartisan conversation on racism, listening, sharing, and growth for the American future. The John Bradamus Center serves as a permanent forum for civil and reasoned discourse, and the center works to ensure that opinions and ideas on these issues are expressed, debated, and formulated for action. Much like the center, FMC works to deepen the understanding of our democratic system and engage the citizenry through civic education about Congress and public service, all on a completely bipartisan basis. We are thrilled to be co-hosting this conversation this evening. Tonight, following the moderated discussion, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function to ask any and all questions you may have for our panelists. And later on in the conversation, the moderators will read several of the submitted questions aloud for discussion. We are very excited to have this distinguished panel for this event: former Senator from Illinois, Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun, and founder and president of Christie Strategies, LLC, the Honorable Ron Christie. But I'm delighted to first introduce the moderators for this discussion. Vince Anani is a first-year NYU student who currently plans on studying at NYU College of Arts and Science with a concentration in politics, philosophy, and business. Vince has spent a number of years living and studying in Ghana. He is an active club leader in the NYU DC community and has led several student-led events so far. We also have Farzana Tasnim, a sophomore at NYU studying journalism, mental health, and the criminal justice system. Farzana was born and raised in Bangladesh and later migrated to Queens, New York. This year, she will serve as NYU DC's Global Equity Fellow and is an intern for the spring 2022 John Bradamus Center Congressional Internship Program. Vince and Farzana, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. And I think we'll start it off with introductions for both Ambassador Moseley Braun and Professor Ron Christie. So to start off, Ron Christie is founder and president of Christie Strategies, LLC, and a former special assistant to President George W. Bush and deputy assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney. He is the author of 3 books, a current instructor at NYU DC, serves on the advisory board to the NYU Bradamus Center, and has been the North American political analyst for the BBC since 2014. In 2020, Christie was awarded the Bronze Medal for Best Documentary and Editorial Viewpoint in the World for his BBC radio documentary, The Trumpeted Republicans. Christie is a life member to the Council on Foreign Relations.
And also tonight we have the Honorable Carol Moseley Braun. Ambassador Moseley Braun served as the United States Senate in the United States Senate from 1993 to 1999 as a Democrat from Illinois, and was the first female senator from Illinois and the first African-American woman to serve in the Senate. As Senator Moseley Braun sponsored progressive education bills and campaigned for gun control. She became the first woman to serve on the Finance Committee, the second woman ever to serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and also served on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, and on the Small Business Committee. In 1999, she became the US Ambassador to New Zealand, a position she held until 2001. Then she taught political science at Morris Brown College in Atlanta and DePaul University in Chicago, and managed a business consulting company in Chicago as well.
All right, thank you for both of you for being here. And to start off the questions for both of you, Vince will introduce.
Yeah, so we mediated some questions that we have targeted for you guys individually, but to open it up as like a little icebreaker, questions that we have more broadly for both of you guys to answer in any order. So a question we have for Ambassador Moseley Braun and for Professor Christie first is, what does Black leadership look like to the two of you individually, especially given your takes, especially given your positions on the political spectrum and your respective positions that you've held over the years, especially your takes now, looking at the political climate today?
I'm smart enough in this instance, Vince, to defer to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you very much, Professor Christie. That was a very brilliant move, actually. Put me on the spot, why don't you? But I just left the White House, a Black History Month celebration. And it was interesting to look around the room because that was the face. The room had everybody who's just about anybody in democratic politics, not just politics, but leadership as well. Colleges, HBCUs, the business community, there were all kinds, the religious community, there were all kinds of people there. And so that's my response. My first response to your question is that it's varied. And I don't think it's possible to say that there is a leader. I don't think frankly, I don't think that's really productive because there's so many different types of leadership and so many different spheres of influence that in which Black people are involved. And I think that starting out with an understanding that the Black community is not a monolith, that we have different views across the board, and that these different spheres of influence do different things to serve the interests and the concerns of the Black community, of Black people. And because again, I'm saying contradictory things. So when you say Black community, really you kind of lumping people together. What I'm suggesting is that we have to take a more nuanced position perspective on this.
To answer the first question, I couldn't agree with the ambassador anymore. There's somehow a monolithic train of thought that certain leaders can speak to an entire race of people. And I think that's entirely wrong. And as the senator knows, and we first met at an event several years back where they invited the living senators, I should say, to an event at the Library of Congress. And it struck me that we had only had a handful of senators in the room. And it shows how far we've progressed as a country, but it shows how far we have to go as a country. When you can put pretty much every living African-American senator in one stage, in one building at one time, and say, here's what we've got for the United States Senate. As Vince knows from, and by the way, by full disclosure, Vince is one of my students. So if he hits me pretty hard, I'm going to hit him pretty hard. No, seriously. But as Vince knows from class, we talked last week about the percentage of African-Americans in the United States Senate, and it was 3%. And I thought, 3%? And then you sit and you think to yourself, well, you're like, well, Raphael Warnock, check. You think Cory Booker, check. And you go Tim Scott, check, and you say 3 members out of 100. So what does Black leadership to me look like today? It looks like, as I said from the outset, we've come so far, but there's so much more that we can do to broaden perspectives, broaden horizons. And that's why I'm honored to be here with the ambassador, Republican, Democrat, but most importantly, Americans, to talk about the Black experience from our experience.
And that's an important thing. And I couldn't agree with Professor Christie more than he said it. He said exactly what I would have said had I been more coherent today. But the point is that there have been 1,820 United States senators since 1789. I was the first Black female. And the numbers are still very, very small. But if you can see the picture behind me, it's a picture of the Senate in 1850. And I can only sit here and imagine what those guys were talking about in 1850, because the country was falling apart in 1850. The good news, I think, is that January 6th notwithstanding, we are Americans and we come together as a country. And I don't think there's any question but that our democracy is going to survive. But we have all been, of all races and ethnicities, have played a role in keeping the democracy alive here. And I think that that is the challenge going forward, is how we're going to seriously refer to our diversity as a real strength and not just see it as something challenging. Mm-hmm. Every now and then I think about the fact, I don't know if it was Peanuts or whatever, the cartoon character where one person would be talking, the other person would hear wang, 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 and unfortunately, the conversation about race tends to be a lot like that. You can have the conversation, but you talk in different languages. And so because people do not really have same shared experiences, and we don't and don't know much about Black history, because of that, I think very often the conversation becomes a wah, wah, wah conversation. And that there's a great misunderstanding because we're not working off the same fundamentals, same precepts about what's involved here. And I think if I have a message for today, it's that Black history is American history.
Yep.
We are all Americans, and we all have to celebrate what it is that makes our country strong and what it is that continues to challenge our country. And we need to face those challenges with an understanding of how far we've come, I think.
As a quick follow-up, you both mentioned how varied Black leadership has been within the United States, that we're all American and that our history is so vast because it is American history overall. And I'm interested, as you said, Ambassador, that as we've gone along, that the issues of race or the conversation of race has become so muddled, how you see going forward, we can encourage all these viewpoints and all these different lived experiences to kind of talk more openly and get into positions or get onto platforms to be able to talk more about that, how you see that going forward for us so that the conversation becomes less muddled.
Well, I think that a start is what you do, and that is to say, to educate young people so that you guys have a sense of the history to begin with, that you are unafraid to speak the truth about that history, and if you have an honest, authentic conversation with one another, then you can break through some of the confusion, I think, and some of the controversies will begin to just dissipate, because I think that really people do want the same things without regard to race or color or anything or ethnicity. And so our challenge is to get to the point where we can have a single conversation with everybody understanding what the fundamentals are and what the basics are.
And to pick up on that point, the one thing I would say here, someone who I know the ambassador served with, is my former boss, who I worked for 8 years, was John Kasich, the former congressman and then governor of Ohio. And he always told me something that has stuck with me to this day. He said, Ron, as a white politician, you know what the Republicans do wrong? We talk to Black people like they're Black people. And he said, we talk about crime, we talk about welfare, we talk about housing, but we don't talk about economic opportunity. We don't talk about job creation. We don't talk about what's on the minds of people of color and all Americans. And the only way that we can move forward is that we stop trying to have a conversation to quote Black America about quote Black issues, but let's talk about the issues that all people care about. And it has stuck with me that he got over 40% of the Black vote when he ran for re-election as governor, because you know what? He didn't talk to Black people like Black people. He talked to his constituents like there was constituents, and they heard what he had to say.
Thank you both for sharing
Thank you.
your thoughts on your moral fundamentals regarding the need for Black history to be American history, and opening the conversation to address systemic issues that aren't usually addressed in political fields. And just to build off, I was wondering how your experiences in both your personal and political life, as Professor, you mentioned some, influenced your political and moral views.
I have to tell you, I have written 3 books in the intersection of race and politics. And the first one that really touched me, I mean, everybody who works in the White House writes their, tell-all, so we won't get to that. But my second book was called Acting White, The Curious History of a Racial Slur. And I will never forget, as a 21, 22-year-old staffer, sitting in a committee hearing room and being the only Black staffer on the Republican side of the aisle, and then returning to my office, and this was a Veterans Affairs Committee hearing, and the phone rang, and it was Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And she asked me to go to her office, which of course, me for being a California native, of course I did, because my great aunt and uncle lived in her district. And I went down there and she got in my face and she said, "You're nothing but a sellout to your race and you're a disgrace and an Uncle Tom because Black people aren't Republicans." So from a personal standpoint, that stung me. I wish at 52, I had the courage at 21 or 22 to have told her what I would have said to her today if she'd said that to me. But it hit me at a very personal and very visceral level that why would people look at me and base how I should vote or base how I should think based on the color of my skin? And that has been something that I've never forgotten. And it's something that I try in my class and I try in my personal life to never judge people based on their political thoughts, but respect them and try to understand where they're coming from as opposed to debase them as a human being.
And if I may pick up here, the fundamental is that our humanity is what ought to guide all of our interactions on this. My grandmother was a Republican. I mean, her generation, most Black people were Republicans because of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, they were so grateful that Abraham Lincoln had gotten rid of slavery. It was like that was where they stayed, and they stayed that way through the Second World War, actually to Roosevelt. And that's why understanding and telling the truth about the history is just so important, because we can dispel and stop a lot of this stuff before it starts, and begin and shine a light of clarity and a light of truth on people's perceptions. Because you're right, Professor Christie, to judge somebody by the color of their skin is racism. Whether it's Republican or Democrat, it's racism. Call it out for what it is. And so I think that it's important, again, that we have these conversations, that we're honest in them, and that we tell people the truth of what we know, of our life experience. Because that's, again, back to diversity. That's the value of diversity. If we're honest about our life experiences, if we're honest about what it is that makes us decide to go left or go right, to be Republicans or Democrats, if we're honest about those things, then quite frankly, we will speak to the universal values and speak to the humanity of the people with whom we are interacting.
100%.
Yeah, and just to follow up with your experience, thank you for sharing, Professor. So you said that you received some backlash from certain groups because of your political spectrum. Can you talk more about the backlash you received from progressive communities? And because we know there is a political spectrum between the Republican and Democratic side, it's not just one way or another. What current policies do you agree with from the Republican side, and what do you disagree with?
How much time do we have? Let me unpack this just a little bit. So I guarantee you that the majority of my NYU students, my Georgetown students, my Cornell students probably don't agree with me as it relates to tax cuts or defense spending, or you can put the potpourri of issues out there. But what I love doing is saying that I'm not here to proselytize. I'm here to educate. And if I've done my job the right way, I take you to the path and the fork in the road, and that you make your decision. And there are certainly times in class, and Vince knows this for being a two-time All-Star, that there are many issues that I perhaps might not agree with, but my opinion in the classroom is not important in that regard. My position in the classroom is to be an educator. But since you opened up the door, so I look at the amount of spending that's going on. We've just surpassed $30 trillion in debt. You look at what is it Build Back Better, and there's certainly many programs in there that I agree with. Universal pre-K. There are a number of things that we can do for children. I agree with the infrastructure package, which was passed in a bipartisan manner. But I worry as a conservative and as a Republican that this administration is trying to do too much too soon and spend far more in our means. And as we certainly look at what's going on in Ukraine with Russia and their hegemonic approach, I also look and think to myself, with so much of our debt being held by China, does China now think that they might have an opening, is it vis-a-vis us and as it relates to Taiwan, that maybe they can be a bit more aggressive in their strategic politics because the United States owes so much money to them?
I had a follow-up from the previous back and forth between the ambassador and you, Professor Christie, about how you said that within today's politics in America, that people do get debased as a human being or as just an American, just completely based off their skin color, and that kind of leading into people just making assumptions about their political affiliations. And I was wondering how you both have dealt with that throughout your professional lives and kind of gone forward in trying to get past that, because I feel like we prevent ourselves from having a lot of these conversations by sticking to your team, like this team or that team, right? With this like partisanship, like ultra loyalty, and how going forward as a political community, how do we kind of destroy these walls so that we can have these conversations, and how have you done that like in your past?
Gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Let me take up different pieces of what you just said. The first is that my experiences in politics and in life would be very different than Professor Christie's, because I'm a woman. And so when you add female to it, you know, you've got a whole nother dynamic going on. In fact, there's a word now that it's made in the circles, misogynoir. And misogynoir is a combination of misogyny and noir, meaning which is the French for Black. So when you take misogynoir and you add that to the equation, it becomes different. And because people have a different set of assumptions, and they are all preconceptions that relate to racism, relate to sexism. You put all that together, and what you got is this really a mess that frankly gets in the way of communication and of understanding. And frankly, I think that part of my challenge is to try to do what I can to beat down those doors and to open up conversation, open up dialogue, so that people can hear what I have to say. It's unfortunate but that's legacy. We're dealing with trying to undo what has been in the water for a long time. And that's very difficult to do. But I think if we start off again, understanding that we have a common humanity, that we have a common objective, which is to keep this country strong, right? We have a common commitment to keeping our democracy strong, I think. And so if we start off with that, we can find a way to communicate with one another that I think will be productive and constructive and not otherwise. So again, when I decided to run for the Senate, let me tell you a quick story. When I thought I was going to run for the Senate, one of the political pundits came up to me and said, don't run. You can't possibly win. The Blacks won't vote for you because you're not part of the Chicago Democratic machine. The whites won't vote for you because you're Black, and nobody's going to vote for you because you're a woman. Well, at that point, I was like, where do I sign up for this job? So it was that challenge, frankly, that did it for me, because he managed to hit all the right notes. He hit my race, he hit my gender, and he hit my political background, you know, because I wasn't part of the Chicago machine. That just was, first off, they didn't want me. Let's start with that. So, you know, we just have to be clear what we're up against. And again, it has deep historical basis and down to and including coverture, which is the way that women have been treated with, you know, which is the same concept underlying the way Black people were treated, that we were somehow incompetent, not as bright, couldn't figure out how to do things on our own. And all those negative assumptions undergird a lot of policy that we're trying to deal with now. And will we have differences of opinion? Obviously. but that's healthy and that's a good thing. And I don't have a problem with moving forward, recognizing what those differences are, listening to the other side, and trying to come out with the middle ground that serves the American people, the interests of the American people.
And to pick up on the ambassador's point, it's so funny. This should prove to those of you who are watching and listening to us this evening that this is how it's supposed to be, right? I mean, we can agree to disagree, but we can do it with a smile, and we can also forge and find common ground. I guarantee you, if the two of us sat down for like 20 minutes, I guarantee you we could find like a whole bunch of issues that we're like, let's go do that. Like, one of my dearest friends is one of her former colleagues, the former senator from Massachusetts, Mo Cowan. And we just sit and laugh all the time. And he's like, Christy, if you and I could just sit here and like hash this out over a couple of beers, like America would be a better place. And I joke with him, but I think if we get the three of us in the room to do that, we could get things done. But to answer the spirit of your question, Vince, I will agree with the ambassador to her point from a different tack of they didn't want me, right? So I have in my email, I have my inbox, I have my sent mail, I have my outbox, and I have hate mail. And the amount of hate mail that I get is tremendous. The amount of death threats that I've received over the years is, disturbing. But I look at it this way. If you spent the time to watch me on television and to listen to what I had to say, and then you went on the internet, then you went to my website, and then you went to my email site on my website, I must have struck a chord in you that you felt that you had to reach out and respond to me. And for those, obviously, I don't respond to the death threats because you don't want to deal with that. But for those who say nasty things to me, I will respond back to them and say, thank you for watching. Thank you for hearing a different perspective. And I will tell you this, 8 times out of 10, they'll write back and say, oh, well, I didn't mean to insult you. I was just upset at the time. But if you engage with people in a dialogue and you open up a dialogue for discussion, as the ambassador mentioned, it's a humanity exchange. It's a person-to-person exchange. It's really hard in politics and in life to dislike people that you know. And if you get the opportunity to know a person, regardless of their politics or their ideological perspective, but you know them as a person, it's hard to be vitriolic towards that person because you kind of like them, even if you don't agree with their politics.
Thank you. Thank you both for answering. Yeah.
Let me put another 2 cents on this. You're exactly right, Professor Christie. And you're right. When I was in the Senate, I particularly, like I said, having broken so many different barriers, I got so much hate mail. And in fact, we had a file cabinet that, I don't know if you remember the commercial, Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Yep.
We had a file cabinet, we call it Cocoa Puffs. And that meant that all the hate letters went into there. And of course, we had to turn over the death threats to the Secret Service. But all the hate mail went into the Cocoa Puffs file.
I love that. The students, you probably won't remember Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but we do. And so in honor of you, I'm going to change my folder from hate mail to Cocoa Puffs. I love that. I love that.
So going a little, thank you both. So going forward a little bit, we wanted to get your guys' takes on your past positions of power and wanted to ask what it meant to both of you individually to have an influence over societal issues, whether it be big or small, and looking to now what you guys both believe is the best way to address societal issues that have cultural roots. Because I remember you just talked about, Ambassador, how there was these things that were just dirty in the water that you're trying to fix, and it's just been there for so long, and it's deeply ingrained within culture. How do you even start to deal with that through legislation when a law can't just 100% fix that?
Well, I'm going to pick up a theme that Professor Christie mentioned, which is you have to do it individually. You can't meet and know everybody. But if you can stake out a position in your life to make a difference on one thing, whatever that thing is, whatever floats your boat, If you can do that, you can begin to make the kind of progress to influence societal change. And otherwise, otherwise you sit outside of the arena, and the arena is not necessarily the Congress. I've served at both state, local, national, and international governments. And I have to tell you, it's something special about being in the actual arena where these things are happening.
Yep.
But what I've found post-retirement is that you can make as much of a difference serving on a board of a homeless shelter, working with the organization of kids, just trying to inspire somebody, going to a school and reading to the children. I mean, whatever you can make a difference in those ways as well. And they're just as important as passing a piece of legislation that deals with the national debt. I mean, there are many different ways to serve, but you have to figure out what it is you like to do and where you want to engage, and just do that. The issue is doing. The issue is not where you're going to do it or how you're going to do it, but just doing and finding something that matters to you.
100%. It's got to be your passion. It's got to be something that gets you up in the morning and you think, I'm not an elected official, but I was a staffer. And I think that when you get engaged in public service, it's all about helping other people. And I'll tell you the story that just, it means so much to me. On my second day when I worked in the White House, the vice president said to me, he said, have you heard of this push to create a Black History Museum as part of the National Mall? And I said, no. And as the senator knows, there's something called a Dear Colleague letter. And there was a Dear Colleague letter that was sent from two Republican representatives, a senator and a representative, and the same thing on the Democratic side. And you look at the folks on the list, and the lead member, of course, was the former icon John Lewis from Georgia. And I didn't realize that ever since 1915, there'd been a push to have a Black History Museum in Washington, D.C. And Vice President said, get this done. I thought, no small task, sir. Thank you very much. And you recognize in politics that it's incremental progress and that it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen next week. It might not happen next year. It took us the better part of 3 years. But one of the greatest moments of my life, other than my wedding, was going to the opening as the guest of the President of the United States and walking through the African American Museum of History and Culture with then Attorney General Eric Holder. And there's the Tuskegee Airmen exhibit, and yet most of the Tuskegee Airmen who were still alive were still there. And you go through the different levels of the museum. Oh, there's Bloody Sunday, and there's John Lewis sitting in a chair, Congressman Lewis. And it proves that if you put your shoulder to the grind and you push and you fight and you believe in something, you can accomplish something. And you can't see it behind me, that on my wall over there is President Bush signing the piece of legislation into law. And I will never forget being in a room with John Lewis and Cicely Tyson and so many amazing Black icons who are weeping because there was finally going to be a museum on the National Mall. And I thought, I just might be a wart on the nose of history, but at least I was there to see it. And every time I drive by it, my heart flutters from it every single day.
It was a great thing. It was a great thing you did.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And it sounds like both of you use that hate mail or any discouragement you received to push for doing what individually mattered to you, and taking that time to know that it takes progress and it takes a lot of work to do what you want to. And that leads me to a question, which is, how well do you think our political sphere right now, or how effective is our political system at the current time?
That's a huge question. And I think the issue comes down to, are we going to protect our democracy? Because without civility and without people being willing to talk to each other And without people being willing to work with one another, you can't have a democracy. You cannot. And that I think is a challenge that we all face right now. There's so much acrimony and anger and people being mean and nasty to each other. You can't, if you're being mean to somebody, you're not going to be able to hear what they have to say. And if you can't hear what they have to say, you certainly can't address their concerns. So I think we have to get past the lack of manners. I mean, that sounds like an old-fashioned term, but it really is about manners. We have to kind of rediscover manners and rediscover civility and how we have to relate to one another if we're going to get anything done and move the needle forward. Because we are right now in one of those periods of retrenchment, which happen from time to time.
Yep.
And I, you know, I mean, historically, there's a pendulum, right? And it goes both ways. And so I'm just hoping that we can regain the civility, regain our ability to communicate with each other. That was one of the reasons why I signed up for this seminar today with the FMC, because I appreciate and applaud anybody who, or any group that wants to work to create a dialogue so that people can have conversations and can appreciate one another and appreciate each other's humanity. I mean, at the end of the day, that really is what it's come down to. And all these issues are pretty abstract unless you break it down to what's the impact on the people.
Could not agree with the ambassador more. And I think the beginning of the end for where we find ourselves now is 1995, right? The Republicans, we ran with our contract with America and we said, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it in a certain amount of time. And one of the things, well, we, the members did, I'm just a humble staffer, was demonize Washington, right? Don't live here, don't be here, spend the night on your air mattress in your office, but don't bring your family here. And it's one thing I learned from my old boss, John Kasich, is that once again, it's hard to really disagree with someone that you know and you like as a person, because you get to know and like them as a person. And I think that we as Republicans and Democrats stopped looking at each other as people and started looking at each other as Republicans and Democrats. And it's snowballed so badly the last couple of decades that the only way, as the ambassador said, that we can get this back is that we recognize it's our civility. But for teaching the American presidency at NYU, I can tell you, everyone thinks, oh, Trump era, and we're never going to get out of this. Look at, for example, Theodore Roosevelt. Look at Andrew Jackson. Look at some of the real bomb throwers from American history where you think, oh my goodness, how are we going to recover from this? We'll recover from this because we have the benefit of the strength of our union, and we have the benefit of time. But it's going to take time, but we have to be honest and open-minded about it of, let's treat people like people and not as Republicans and Democrats.
I had a follow-up because Ambassador Mosley Braun talked about this unity that we need, that the civility that we need within Congress and within the political sphere. And Professor Christie, you both talked about the deficit, and you talked specifically about like the Build Back Better plan. And what we saw in Congress earlier in the year and late last year was a lot of gridlock trying to get that bill passed. And I was wondering if you believe that will always be a problem with that lack of civility, because I agree with you, Professor Christie, that there was from the Democratic side some reckless spending within that bill, and this process of gridlock has to happen so that bills can come out to really make a difference and help people. But with the amount of time that it takes and with this lack of civility within Congress and with this lack of unity, do you believe that will always be a problem within Congress and positions of political power? And I want to get your guys' take on that, especially seeing as you both have overseen that process a little and have more insight on that.
Well, if I may, Professor Christie, let me correct you, Vince. Unity is not the issue, because you're never going to have people agreeing on everything.
Yep.
And the thing about the legislative process, and particularly when you're talking nationally, it touches every aspect of our lives, all over the world. You know, again, Professor mentioned Ukraine. I mean, here we are. I don't know about you, but I've traveled extensively, but I've never been to Ukraine.
Mm-mm.
But I care about what's going on there. And so it's not a matter of unity. It is more a matter of using the process, the dialogue, and the contest to find common ground. That's what you're seeking to do, common ground, which you may or may not get there. On some things we haven't, some things we got there quickly, other things it takes longer. But again, without civility, you can't have the exchange of ideas, the exchange of perspectives. You can't have the kind of back and forth that will create something that's workable for everybody. And a democracy strives to do that. I mean, the whole idea is the demos, right? The people as a whole, government by the people, for the people, and of the people. That's what we're striving for. But you can't get there unless you're listening to the other side, unless you're open to the exchange of ideas, unless you are committed to finding common ground. And that is the challenge, I think, for all of us.
So Vince will see this in class this week. I have a slide, and I'll pick up on the ambassador's point, where it talks about the state of affairs for a Supreme Court nomination in the Senate. And they have 6 blue tanks. And on the other side, there are 6 red tanks. They're sitting in a circle and they're like ready to shoot at each other. And we keep going back to this notion of civility, right? That I can say to you as a conservative Republican, and I'm not in the Attila the Hun League, but I'm pretty conservative. But I think that Merrick Garland, the Democrat, got a bad shake by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell by not allowing him to get an up or down vote for his nomination. I think the President of the United States, with the advice and consent of the Senate, should be able to put forth a nominee. They should have hearings and they should get a vote. And the Republicans didn't give him a vote. What do you think that did to the Democrats? That ticked them off. How do you think they're going to react the next time that you get a Republican nomination? And you just have to preserve the comity, COMITY, of the Senate. And again, I feel so weird saying this to a senator when I'm just a humble staffer. Yeah, but that's how it's supposed to work. And you look at Antonin Scalia, how overwhelmingly he was voted on by Democrats and Republicans alike. And the president, I'm sorry, they won. They get their deference of who they want. And so we now look at this new nominee that President Biden has put forth, and you hear all these Republicans saying, we're not going to, she's this and that. No, I'm like, that's not your job. Your job is to advise and consent or not. But you shouldn't be taking shots at the president's nominee because they won the election and they deserve to put forth their nominee.
As a former member of the Judiciary Committee, because I was on the Judiciary Committee when I was in the Senate, my predecessor, Senator Paul Simon, used to say the only thing that we are looking for is to make sure that the nominee has a good head and a good heart. And so you want to look at qualifications first, and then look at what they've done in their lives to show the level of humanity and understanding and compassion for others that would befit a Supreme Court justice. And unfortunately, the acrimony has gotten so bad. This nomination, I think, Judge Jackson ought to be bulletproof. She's been confirmed 3 times. She's got all the credentials in the world. I mean, what more do you want? How much more Harvard do you want? Seriously. How much more magna cum laude do you want? I mean, and she comes with all the credentials, frankly, and unfortunately, credentials is with anybody Black. That's like one of the first places that people go is looking at credentials, and that's a throwback to the 18th and 19th centuries. To say that the Black people don't have the intellectual heft to be able to serve as Supreme Court justices. If Thurgood Marshall didn't prove anything, he disproved that. But the fact of the matter is that she's going to have a rougher time, frankly, than she should. And again, I come back to the word I gave you, misogynoir, right? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that she's a woman, that they think they can get away and just do this. It's unfortunate, but that's where things are right now. And we just have to get past this period and restore manners and restore civility and
But I will
confidence.
say, I do think she's going to, say, I don't want to say sail, but I think that she's going to get confirmed.
Oh, there's no question about it. That's right. Because she certainly got the credentials. She's got
Harvard
the
times
F.
two.
Yep.
And speaking on this topic about how the political world, especially the political world at least, differentiates between the Democratic and Republican side so severely due to opposition in important issues such as abortion laws, or as one of the audience members brought up, the teaching of critical race theory, which calls into question the moral views of people. How can the public find that common ground you were talking about, Ambassador, or explain those views in elections or in politicians?
Again, I think if you speak to people honestly and in language they can understand, you can get past some of the labels. I mean, if anything, that has always kind of been one of my particular areas of concern, is that people have gotten so much into branding and into slogans and whatnot that it obscures any ability to get to what it is you're really talking about. And so a lot of this back and forth is a battle of the slogans. And so if we can get past the slogans and get to what are we actually looking for here? And that's why I mentioned what Paul Simon told me about, a good head and good heart. I mean, once you get past her credentials and get past her life experience, how are you going to be opposed to that? I mean, other than being opposed to the president who nominated her, which I gather there's a lot of that floating around, but it doesn't make any sense. It certainly gives rise to supports gridlock in our political process, undermines faith in the process. And quite frankly, the most important thing we have here is people believing that our democracy can work for them. Whether it does work for them or not is our challenge. But people have to believe that our democracy is something that they can take pride in. And I think that the way we do that is to get past the sloganizing and the name calling and get past all of that noise and get to the heart of the matter that we're looking at.
And, I'd say I'm a co-founder of a group. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary the other year called No Labels. And for those of you, we always want interns. So for those of you NYU students, nolabels.org. But our motto was fix it, not fight. And, we had former Senator Joe Lieberman as one of our national co-chairs. We had Joe Manchin, the current senator from West Virginia, as one of our co-chairs, and my mentor, the former governor from Utah, John Huntsman. And it was fascinating to me. And I guarantee the ambassador would be like, say what? Like, the members would meet once a month. We have 100 members. It's just about 100 members, about half Republicans, half Democrats. And they sit down once a month and they say, hey, Ambassador, what bills are you working on? What do you have? And she would come out with a folder and with her Dear Colleague letters. Dear Colleague letters are like essentially, Dear Member of Congress, here's my bill, here's what I'm doing, please come on board. And she'd say, would you sign on board? And me, fictitious Ron, Republican member of Congress, would say, that sounds pretty good to me. And you watch these members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats and independents. I mean, Angus King is one of our folks, and they co-sponsor each other's legislation. And then they go to the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House, and they speak about, oh my goodness, Peter Welch, this left-wing guy from Vermont, but you've got a conservative Republican speaking in favor of his legislation. And I think that's exactly it. It's beyond sloganeering, beyond the ideological, like, I don't like you because you're a Democrat, or you don't like me because I'm a Republican, but we like each other as people, and let's find that common ground. And I have loved being a fly on the wall of this for the last 10 years.
Well, congratulations on that organization. I hadn't heard of it before today, but I will look it up. Thank you.
So many of your colleagues are on that.
It sounds wonderful. But let me say this. When I was in the Senate, I have a picture at my desk at home that I'm very, very proud of. One of the things that I personally did was I got involved with trying to talk about the Underground Railroad, which, as you know, is not a railroad, but it's how people escaped to freedom from slavery. And my co-sponsor on that bill was the current Republican governor of Ohio. I don't know what it is about Ohio, Ron, but
Good old Mike DeWine.
Yeah, Mike DeWine. And we worked together to pass that. And now I'm so proud because, quite frankly, I turned on the television the other day and there was a program about discovering the Underground Railroad. And they didn't mention our legislation, but I was really excited to see that there were people from the Park Service involved with all these different archaeological excavations and investigations. And all I could think was, I had something to do with that. That was really important. So did Mike DeWine. We did it together. And now the country has the benefit of some historical research that needed to be done, that wasn't being done, that now is happening because of that kind of coming together. And I got to tell you, that is a great feeling, and that's a great challenge, but it's a great feeling to do when you can contribute like that.
I'll say this in a minute, Ambassador. The best client that I ever had was the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which is in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was from legislation from Louis Stokes, from the Cleveland area, and my political mentor, Rob Portman, a Republican from Cincinnati. There must be something in the water in the Midwest, right? I don't know what you all are doing in the Midwest, but there's got to be something in the water. But that Republicans and Democrats come together and say, you know what? Underground Railroad, which wasn't a railroad, but let's do this. Oprah came in, gave a lot of money. She did the opening narration in the theater. There's a slave thing, but you did it for the kids. You did it for the educational thing, and you did it because it was the right thing. And I just wish that our folks would reflect on that and say, let's do this for the country and not do it for, is it the red or the blue jersey?
Exactly.
But that water in the Midwest, maybe I need to move out there and drink some of the water.
Lake Michigan.
Thank you guys both for your thoughts on that. We wanted to open it up to the Q&A box for any participants within the panel who had any questions. So one question that was kind of repeating that was in relation to history and the teaching of critical race theory. Someone had the question of, do we have a common history if state governments and school boards pick and choose what parts of our history can or cannot be discussed in school? And wanted to get your guys' takes on that, especially if we're talking about civility and trying to break this wedge.
Let me say this. I think that state and local governments have a special responsibility to educate, period. And that means telling the whole truth, whatever that is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's up to them to make sure the students get an opportunity to learn the full story to the extent that we know it. I mean, there's still a lot of archaeological stuff going on that we're finding things out, but to the extent that we do have the facts, we have to begin to have a commitment to facts and again, not fictions and not slogans. And so I just think that do state and local governments have a responsibility? Absolutely they do, because that's in their job description. It is to give children, young people, the opportunity to learn whatever subject matter it is. They've got to give the whole truth and nothing but. So yeah, that's my long answer.
And my short answer is that I agree 100% with the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, and just move on and see what else we got. I agree with her 100%.
Thank you. Farzana, do you have any questions that you want to pick out?
Yeah, there was one from Cynthia. It's saying, would you please give your opinion / evaluation of the upcoming UN Commission on the State of Women this year? Will be virtual again. There are currently 75,000 registrants.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. It should do a really good job because the state of women all over the world is really on the bubble right now. And quite frankly, one of the things the United Nations has prescribed, it hasn't happened yet, is that women get more involved with government. I couldn't agree more, because women have a tendency to be more reality focused, more focused on the facts. How they're going to feed their children. How are the children going to get educated? I mean, it really is forward looking. And because women do deal with we are still the primary caregivers in families. And so you get a different focus when you've got females in leadership positions. In Africa, right now, I think there are only 2 female heads of state. And
Wow.
which may be one of the reasons why we have so many problems there. And here we're building to, we haven't gotten the critical mass really in terms of women in the Congress, but there are more women now than ever before, which is a good thing. I mean, that shows progress. What it shows though is a breaking down of barriers to entry that have existed in some cases for centuries against women's participation in the public sphere. And to the extent that the United Nations Forum will take that up, I think it'll be a positive contribution across the board.
There's a question that was more targeted for you, Professor Christie, in your field of being with the Republican side, wanting to know how we can find common ground, because someone asked, we've tried to engage folks in community discussions, but I find that we can't get conservative people to be a part of those discussions. What would help conservatives and Republicans feel more welcomed to join community discussions structured around to help us find common ground?
I don't think so much at NYU, but certainly some of the other institutions that I teach in, that Republicans find themselves sort of in the bunker, and that they don't want to articulate their conservative viewpoints because they're fearful that people will shoot at them. And so they'd rather remain in the bunker. I think some of the best events that I've been engaged in are when the Republican Club and the Democratic Club have joint events and they have joint speakers, and you have the opportunity to hear from both sides. And it's sponsored by 2 of the major political parties. And I think it's so well done to do it that way. And to my NYU student community, I would say, if there's a Republican that you think maybe you're not sure where they're coming from, ask them, talk to them, speak to them. Don't confront them, but just speak to them as a person. And you might be remarkably surprised how welcome they are for that interaction. I loved that when I was in college. And I would hope that the same atmosphere rings true for us at NYU, that people would feel that comfortable, student to student, person to person, to have that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to close out, to both of you, do you have any advice for future politicians, future students looking to get into public policy? Anything from your experience in the field that you'd like to share?
Well, I put my 2 cents in. I think learn what it is that learn the job description of what it is you're looking at, whether it's state or local or national or international politics. Figure out, learn because a lot of people really get them confused and don't know the difference. I've seen people running for garbage collector talking about international issues. It's like, excuse me, that's not exactly your portfolio. So learn what the job is, what you're interested in. Bore down and focus on that and get to be the best at that you can. And then figure out some way to be of service to others. Because at the end of the day, this is supposed to be about service and not about you. Not about you sitting on the dais, not about you getting the accolades or having somebody put honorable in front of your name. It's about what can you do for other people. It's like that old gospel song, if I can help somebody.
Amen to all of that. And I would conclude with this: don't let anybody tell you what you can't do. You're too young, you're too this, you don't have enough experience. If you want to do it, if your dream, your drive, you get that dream and you go. And you found 2 folks here tonight who we have followed our passion and our dreams. And I'm just honored and tickled to be on the stage with the ambassador and the senator.
My pleasure. It's mutual. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And we're sorry that we couldn't get to every question that was asked within the group box. But thank you, Ambassador Moseley-Braun, and thank you, Professor Christie, for joining us in this talk. And we really appreciate you guys just openly talking, having discussion, answering all of our questions and your
Yeah, thank you
experiences.
so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night.